on to the next thing that white leftists suck at, which, come to think of it, things that white leftists suck at maybe should have been the title of this video. But next on the list is empathizing with people that they disagree with. But I fully understand this tendency. Like, I grew up around a lot of Christian conservative white people, and man, oh man, are they fucking annoying. But they're also people. And people deserve and require empathy. There's definitely a tendency on the left to be constantly enthralled by the notion that everything is getting worse all the time. But like, let's have a little perspective. I remember very well, not that long ago, when being anti-gay marriage was a viable and safe political position. Fucking Obama claimed to be anti-gay marriage for a time. But now, it's barely even a question. The same thing goes for trans people. The Republicans are doing all they can to undo it, and there is most certainly a long way to go in terms of complete cultural embrace of trans people. But the progress that has been made in boosting their visibility and validating them in the past few years has been quite remarkable. It's not enough, but it's a start. And it's a start that barely even 10 years ago would have been unimaginable for a lot of people. We've got to remember that the core animating ideology of conservatism is a reactionary politics that is responding to a sense of cultural loss or threat. The potent mix that gave birth to Trumpism was 8 years of a black president, an economy that the Republicans wrecked and then blamed on the black guy, increasing domination of popular media by black and brown people, demographic trends that indicate the fall of the hegemony of the white man, the slow demise of Christianity, the death of the gender binary, etc. All of the contradictions of Trump as a person, Trumpism, and all of the beta-ass militias associated with it make sense if you return to the fact that conservatism is about fighting to maintain a hierarchy that is widely perceived as being under threat. Which it is. Let's embark on a thought experiment that might get me canceled, but fuck it. Imagine that you're some Episcopalian white dude from Wyoming named Randy. That's you. You're Randy now. You're like 50 years old. You never went to college. You never left your hometown. You got married young, and you dropped out of high school. You've basically spent your whole life driving trucks 60 hours a week, hunting, and watching TV. Everyone around you is white, and they pretty much all have the same values as you. Yet all of a sudden, all around you, thanks to the internet making the world way smaller, it seems that the culture that you grew up in and identified with has begun to disappear. You begin to realize that the racial and cultural makeup of the country that you grew up in is changing fast, and that the story that has long been a core part of your identity is being challenged and revised. You have never once questioned the gender binary as anything but God's honest truth. Yet suddenly, everyone is proclaiming on the internet that if you don't fully accept their claims about gender, then you're just as bad as a racist. And well, that doesn't fully make sense to you. What you understand about the history of racism in the United States doesn't really have much to do with trans people. At least from your perspective, it doesn't. And all of your attempts to express your anxiety about a sense of cultural loss have been met with dismissiveness, and have often resulted in people again branding you and everything that you stand for as racist. Even many of the white people that you encounter on the internet seem to see you as racist, when that's not something that you've ever really considered yourself to be. And many of them are very reticent to express any empathy with your feeling that your culture is changing into something that you barely recognize. Combined with all this, you've been watching the economic prosperity of your community crumble over the past few decades, along with the slow disintegration of the social fabric that has given you and your people meaning for so long. So, how might you go about understanding all this? Are you going to move to California and enroll in UC Santa Cruz and double major in critical race theory and gender studies so you can figure out what this is all really about? Or are you going to try to fit this into all the frameworks that you already have and turn to the media that you already trust to give you what you think is the straight and narrow truth? Because maybe you've even tried to engage with some of these arguments via internet discussions, but the acerbic impatience with which demands have been made of you to accept their claims has turned you off. So instead, you're just going to sit back, watch a little Tucker, maybe a little Sean, maybe a little Benny Boy. They never talk down to you. They talk in a language that you can understand. They tell you what you want to hear. Now, pump the brakes, everyone. Slow down, take a deep breath. I am completely sympathetic to trans people that feel that they need to do everything they can to assert their identity because they live in a society that invalidates them and violates them and discriminates against them. Trans people and non-binary people are valid. Full fucking stop. I'm only using discussions around trans people as an example because it's, relevant. Consider that so many white people have long falsely seen the US as a Christian country, and traditional Christianity is pretty clear about gender roles and gender hierarchy. It's literally a cosmology based around a sky daddy. So, what do you think will happen when the mass of popular culture and polite society, thankfully, moves away from that model? A lot of people are gonna freak the fuck out, because by challenging their status as top of the trash heap white people who live in a neatly ordered world where man dominates woman and nature and Sky Daddy dominates man, forgive me, Daddy, their entire cosmology is going in the trash can. And if you've lived your entire life internalizing these narratives as the natural order of the universe, things are going to quickly seem really fucking bonkers to you. Like, imagine what it would be like if everyone in Iran suddenly learned that in 30 years, Islam would be in the toilet and the dominant ethnic group of the country would be in the minority and their traditional gender roles would be done away with. Would the only appropriate response be to admonish them for being racist and bigoted because they feel anxious about this? Now I know all too well what the leftist counter is to this anxiety about racial and cultural changes. Just get over it, guys. You've always had everything forever, and the entire reason that you're alive is because of all this racism that people did, and your fears and anxieties are invalid, and if you want to express them, then you're just being racist. Now, I kind of agree with this argument, but the emphasis and the delivery of it are an ineffective ass heap of a dumpster fire. The grand irony of the facts don't care about your feelings aesthetic is that it is literally the inverse of the primary functional conservative rationale. Conservatism is almost entirely based on the feeling of loss that accepts facts that are favorable to its narrative and rejects ones that are not. Therefore, you're not going to persuade these people with a well-researched, well-reasoned treatise on how white identity has long been used as a weapon of oppression. So, conservatism and the right have long been a my feelings don't care about your facts ideology. Just look at how they've reacted to climate change. I feel that my culture is threatened. I feel that my identity is eroding away. I am afraid that I won't recognize my country anymore. And the lefty impulse is to say, good, now get over it. But that should be a pretty plainly problematic approach to the concern. When has invalidating anybody's feelings, whether or not you agree with them, ever helped you to reach a common understanding? I get that the reason for not feeling the need to validate or empathize with these feelings of cultural loss comes down to a question of historical power dynamics and not feeling the need to apologize for their shifting. And that's a perfectly reasonable argument to make for a person of a marginalized identity. But in my opinion, it's not a very compassionate or helpful view to adopt if you're privileged and white. My critique here is not that people of oppressed groups need to coddle white people in their communications. My critique is that people of non-oppressed groups, like myself, need to do a way better job of imagining and manifesting a space in which these feelings and anxieties about white identity and cultural change can be expressed in a healthy way. And also, very importantly, if we on the left have thoroughly deemed discussions around white anxiety to be taboo and invalid, what do you think will happen? It won't just cause these sentiments to evaporate into thin air. It'll just polarize them and give the chicken nugget pundits and the very online neo-fascist twerps the monopoly on them. In the words of progressive political organizer George Gohl, we need to find ways to make meaning for our white compatriots in this changing world, to offer counter-narratives to the poisonous screeds of the right-wing media machine. And being able to do that begins with empathy. It begins with the acceptance of the common humanity of the person that you disagree with. It begins by challenging yourself to put yourself in their shoes and to not just write them off. Because if they feel like your side has shut them out, then there is only one other option, and they are more than happy to take them and their indignant rage in. My great-great-great-grandfather fought in the American Civil War on the cool side. He was an officer with an Indiana regiment and was wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. I have long felt proud of that heritage, but I'm also under no illusion that my grandfather may not have given a single fuck about freeing no slaves, that he may very well have actively participated in, and at the very least benefited from, the genocide of Native people. If my ancestors had fought on the other side, there could be a part of me that might want to feel proud of that heritage. At the very least, I would probably want to think that the guy that did the fighting was a bit of a badass. But the moral grounds of the state that this theoretical guy defended were pretty fucked. Kind of like, in many ways, the moral grounds of the state that my ancestor defended were also pretty fucked. So I can empathize with someone who wants to believe that they're of a lineage of people that fought for what they believe to be right, even if they were actually wrong. Though, that doesn't mean that I think they should be allowed to drench themselves in lies about the whole thing, or fly racist flags, or erect statues to racist traitors. History is complicated and messy. People are complicated and messy. Chances are we're all descended from at least half a dozen people that did something really fucked up at some point. So, what is there to do about it? To be honest about history, and to acknowledge that that burden of shame is all of our burden to bear. And there is no transcending it. That the only way to move beyond it is to integrate it into our self-conception. Come to terms with it. Forgive each other for it. And to see about righting our wrongs together. To fully own that our existence as white people in this land, regardless of class, regardless of education, regardless of location, is soaked in blood. And we need to stop lying to ourselves about that. And we need to forgive ourselves for it. And then we need to do our best to carry each other down the road of freedom and collective liberation that Black and Indigenous leaders have been building for so long. To distance yourself from the white that you have deemed to be less than you is the road to another civil war. For those who feel cast out and condescended to will coalesce into a white-hot ball of rage. And then they will bring violence to the very communities that you claim to be fighting for. Shadowboxing with the caricature of your enemy only further manifests that enemy into reality. And then it festers. And then it votes fascist in 2024. Shit. One of the major debilitating flaws of leftist political vibes is that the state, especially colonial states like the US, are fundamentally illegitimate. This is another impulse that I more or less in theory agree with, because, the USA as we know it wouldn't exist without rapacious capitalism and slavery and stealing hella land from indigenous people, etc., etc. And if your entire mythos as a nation is built on stabbacks, broken promises, ecocidal capitalism, and systemic racism, well, it's a pretty damning indictment. But the impulse to write off the state as a reason to disengage politically is very counterproductive. And it's indicative of something that I think we all need to get just a little bit better at. That is, dwelling comfortably in the endless, morally ambiguous shades of gray that is our collective identity. Climate change activism is a really good example of learning to live like this. If we are all a group of climate activists, and we set out to quantify our individual carbon footprints, or paw prints, and then decided to shun those among us with the highest carbon footprints as being antithetical to the movement, we very soon would no longer be a group of activists. We'd just be a bunch of random, bitter people that had focused way more on our individual iniquities instead of banding together to address the larger problem. And so the embittered, broken-hearted leftist, forced to bear the weight of all the truths of a late capitalist, ecocidal society, then begins to feel that the best thing to do would just be to burn it all down. Once the revolution starts, then we'll really start living. Then we can all manifest our Marxist-Leninist dream state, and everyone will have a Kropotkin beard, and the patriarchy and the economic infrastructure of everything we've ever known will suddenly just disappear. And we'll all dance around a fire, and global warming will end, and the glaciers will return, except this time there'll be giant blocks of frozen LSD that we can all pilgrimage to and lick in order to gain their ancestral knowledge. And we can all enter into polyamorous relationships with the sentient, sexy tiger people who have suddenly evolved, and they can do a lot of crazy shit with that tail of theirs, and it's not gonna happen, y'all. Like, just sit and try to actually imagine a situation in which the United States government, wielding greater military forces and weapons than the world has ever known, were to come crashing down. Imagine all the factionalized violence that would erupt out of that. Each little fucking baby Proud Boy militia would go and declare their own micro-state of Kekistan, and they would all be warring with each other, and the world would be awash with guns and violence, and so many people would die. And our little happy leftist revolution fantasy wouldn't make it very far unless we were willing to kill and die indefinitely. One other state tried to pull away from the US government before, and I think we can all remember how that went. And it's going to be pretty hard to implement comprehensive economic policies and a global overhaul of infrastructure if the entire world has turned into the wastes of a Fallout 3 murderscape. I feel all of this very strongly because I myself have in the past actively fantasized about some vast revolution that would lead us all to some sort of ecologically enlightened one world government where a reincarnated Maria Sabina is queen of the earth and the global council of elders takes mushrooms once a month and everyone is required to sit and talk to plants at least once a day. But then I got a little older and realized that any major systemic change that will come to our world will not come without massive, massive violence and death. Maybe it'll still come to that further down the line. But since I believe that humanism needs to be a central tenet of addressing climate change and instilling greater ecological awareness, I'm not ready to be okay with the guaranteed slaughter of millions of people. And so, this brings me back to the legitimacy of the state. I think we can all agree that we like roads and schools and shit. Those things don't happen in a vacuum. Also, know who else thinks that the US government is illegitimate? These guys, and these guys, and these guys. Look at these simulacra of the Ubermensch. But they have never had a problem with pulling the levers of government so that they can gain power and then tear apart the system from within. You know, I actually lived in Germany last year, and I would get to talking with lefty Germans about, that one thing. And the way that they would tell it is that if the German state were to just disappear tomorrow from the face of the earth, they wouldn't bat an eye. Obviously, this is all in response to the crimes committed by their parents in the not-so-distant past, and the revulsion to any sense of pride in their country was very palpable. Understandably. But to me, coming from a state where rebel flags still fly high and people still venerate the genocidal grandpas of yore, the way in which German society has stared themselves into the face of their worst crimes and sworn to never lie to themselves about it is a reason to be proud of the modern German state. That they lifted themselves up from the devastation and moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime and created a place that is prosperous and peaceful and progressive and honest about its past is the reason that they should be proud. It's a hell of a lot better than we've ever done in the US. There are a lot of things wrong with the United States. Like a ton of them. But how do we change that? We think realistically and we devise strategies to gain more power. We make ourselves intelligible to the other side, and we do that by practicing fluency in the symbolic language that they understand. That means flying the flag. That means, in certain situations, amending the lecture about how white people are the worst thing that ever happened to the world, and just getting straight to how your ideas are better than the other side's. That means being patriotic, finding a reason to be proud of your country, because the people that you need to reach are proud of their country, and they fly the flag, and that could be common ground. Now, I know how icky that sounds. How could I ever be proud of a country that has done so much bad stuff? Find a way, dude. Be proud of the part of your country that fought and bled and died for civil rights and black liberation. Be proud of the part of your country that contributed to the fall of the Third Reich. Be proud of the part of your country where we can even have this discussion. Be proud of the part of your country that created jazz, the blues, and rock and fucking roll. Be proud of your generation, who will definitely make this earth a better place. Be proud of your unborn descendants, who need you now, today, to fight for the earth that they will inherit. Be proud of the country that you will grow old in, which will be a lot less white and a lot less conservative. Be proud of yourself for having the audacity to be hopeful in the face of so much violence and injustice and despair. Be proud of the part of your country that needs to address the sins of the past so that we can live in a more just future. Be proud of our common humanity and the fact that we are all learning together how to make the world just a little less shitty. Stop talking like a leftist. Start talking like an American. Also, I don't know if you've noticed, but the fascists among us are very comfortable with these common patriotic symbols. And what does that say about our side if they have thoroughly appropriated them as their symbols? Might it then be made very easy for them that we, being so uncomfortable with the language and symbols of patriotism, are un-American, anti-American, anti-freedom? It's going to be really hard to equitably address climate change when Republicans have locked us out of state power because they change the rules every time they win, because they convince their base that we hate America because we're so bad at not implying that we hate America. The same thing goes for framing all this discourse around certain strains of whiteness being the root of all evil. Because in the minds of the people that you need to be persuading, a certain semiotic interpretation will occur. If all their saying is that whiteness is the problem with everything. And if I'm white, well, I guess they must be against me. This is reverse racism. And so my critique here is that white progressives need to do a better job of essentially code switching. We don't all need to be talking like Ibram X. Kendi all the time. We need to have a little grace for our compatriots that we don't agree with so that we can find the inroads of common identity and potentially come together on a common cause. And what's an easy, partly nonverbal way to do so? Symbolism and cultural signaling. You can't tweet yourself out of your white guilt. Now, that doesn't mean that we should pretend race or racism doesn't exist and do the whole I don't see color shtick. That is exactly not what I'm saying. My point is, we need to figure out ways to translate this message of racial and climate justice into the vernacular of the context that we're operating in. Like, imagine we're doing this work in a different country. Would the way to reach the people that you're trying to communicate with be to go in and tell them that everything they stand for is really bad and they should totally feel guilty about it? Or would the way to reach them be to gain a deeper understanding of their culture and then convey your message within the context of that cultural understanding? Listen, I get it. White bread milquetoast communities in the middle of nowhere America aren't cool. We'd much rather throw down the streets with BLM. It looks way better on the gram. But white leftists need to focus more heavily on the communities that their people founded, because they're the problem, and they're either coming with us or they're dragging us down. You've got to bring the other white people along with you so that we can turn the wheels of democracy, so that we can turn the page on this age of climate-killing political institutions and usher in a racially equitable, decarbonized tomorrow. And that starts by becoming more fluent in the symbolic language of those that we need to reach the most. To me, the politico-cultural and ecological phenomenon that is climate change is the beating heart of every major issue that we face today, from inequality to racial justice. This is especially true in the US, where the conservative response to climate change has traced a certain fault line in the American consciousness that just may yet prove fatal to us. To me, it is very clear that the very same mental gymnastics that gave birth to the lost cause myth gave us the very same cultural equipment to deny the urgent truth of climate change and all that it says about us. This all-pervasive collective deception is so poisonous to us, and it is a very good example of why climate change and racial justice need to be considered the same fight. In both the cases of the lost cause myth and climate change denial, powerful institutions have had a vested interest in keeping people's egos tethered to the very toxin that has caused them and so many others to suffer. In both cases, these white supremacist institutions have very deftly dodged any attempts to try to make them take any blame or responsibility, constantly playing a game of smoke and mirrors to keep their subjects angry, confused, and convinced that they're the real victims. And honestly, in many ways, our side has made it easier for them to do so, because we're just not very good at interrupting their narratives. We're really good at talking to each other and making ourselves feel totally validated, but that only goes so far. A cultural con job that, to this day, allows some of us to grow up learning that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, or that the Confederate flag isn't a symbol of racism, or Robert E. Lee was a good Christian man, is the very same rhetorical obfuscation that has allowed half of our political establishment to this day to deny that the rapid death of the biosphere isn't a big problem at all. So, what must we do? We must be honest with ourselves, and we must stand by each other, even with those that we may not fully agree with. We must do a better job of cementing our common social bonds so that the self-interested forces of white supremacy can no longer hijack the minds of our people and turn them into pawns in their game. We must tear down the racist symbols of the past, but we must also have the grace to forgive those that still cling to them. We must come up with a story that tells the truth about the horrors of the past, but which finds pride in the notion that we are all still worthy of redemption. And that work of salvaging and revising notions of white identity needs to be led by white people. We can't keep ignoring those among us who are the most problematic and then forcing our non-white comrades to pay the price for our neglect. And we can't expect non-white people to do the work of unfucking our own communities. By deeming the racist white people among us as beyond salvation, it's to tacitly accept that they will continue to inflict physical and structural violence on non-white people. Something that I think we can all agree is categorically unacceptable. This planet is the only home that we've got, and all of our fates are bound up together on it. Elon may be trying to spread our interplanetary seed or some shit, but I can guarantee you he's not bringing y'all's bickering asses along with him. And so, moving forward together is our only option. And I've got to say, guys, the Republican Party these days is looking pretty damn weak. Like, their entire political platform is screeching about cancel culture and trans girls running track and worshipping some geriatric golfer who lives in Palm Beach. They know they're weak because they know that they're losing. So they feel their only recourse is to tear apart the system from within. They know they're losing because they have always lost. From the Civil War to civil rights to their flaccid-ass attempt to take the Capitol. They will stall for as long as they can, and they will do as much damage as they can in the meantime, but eventually, their white supremacy and their climate killer denialism will go the same way as slavery. The question is whether or not it will take another civil war to get us there, which, let me remind you, is what they want. So, let's not give it to them. The realities of democracy mean that we need to be constantly building our coalition, because that's the way to power, and power is the way to policy, and policy is the way to progress. And one of the first crucial steps on that road to progress is creating a story that all of our fellow citizens can believe in. And that story needs to be very clear about what parts of our past aren't coming with us. And then I was like, yeah, girl, I'm a Sigma in the streets, but an Alpha in the sheets. And then I knew she totally wanted me. Yo, dude, I just heard there's a bunch of SJWs trying to enjoy their day outside somewhere. You should totally go try to make them debate you about some shit that you definitely don't understand. Aw, bro, great idea. That was easy. Don't think we'll mind if we borrow this. This racist rag, which I totally bought with my own money and did not steal, is a great place to start. So, as my little contribution to the shattering of the lie of the lost cause, we're going to have a little flag retirement ceremony while we sing a song of the South.
Whoa, way down south in the land